What if I told you that the very first humans weren't hunters, warriors, or even rulers of their world, but scavengers, barely 4 feet tall, armed with nothing more than broken rocks? Yet from those rocks came a spark that would ignite the story of us. This is Homo Habilis, the handyman. They lived 2.4 million years ago in a world filled with saber-tooths, vultures, and predators that could tear them apart in seconds. And yet, somehow, they survived. Not through brute strength, but through something far more powerful: intelligence, imagination, and cooperation. Here's the question: were they really so different from us? Or were they already carrying the very essence of humanity we see in ourselves today? Stick around, because by the end of this video, you may never look at the word human the same way again. Close your eyes for a moment and picture Africa, 2.4 million years ago. The air is hot, the ground is cracked, and predators rule every shadow. Saber-tooths stalk the grasslands, vultures circle overhead, and hyenas laugh in the distance. Now, imagine a small figure, barefoot, wiry, alert, moving cautiously through this unforgiving landscape. This isn't quite us, but it isn't an ape either. This is Homo habilis, one of the very first ancestors to earn the name human. Scientists often call them the handyman, because for the first time in history, hands were shaping more than survival. They were shaping the future. Their tools weren't fancy, just sharp flakes of stone chipped from a larger rock. But with that simple innovation, everything changed. Suddenly, bones left behind by predators weren't just scraps. They were meals waiting to be cracked open, for marrow. And here's the thing, that one decision to break a rock and turn it into a tool set Homo habilis apart. For the first time, survival wasn't just about instinct. It was about creativity. It was about thought. It was about a spark of something that feels undeniably human. But how did they live day to day in a world so harsh? And what made them different from the creatures that came before? Day-to-day life for Homo habilis was a razor's edge between survival and extinction. Imagine waking each morning not to the sound of an alarm clock, but to the rustle of predators nearby. Their homes weren't built of wood or stone. They were scattered shelters, caves, or the shade of acacia trees. Safety came not from walls, but from staying constantly alert. Food was the greatest struggle. They weren't top hunters, far from it. Lions, leopards, and saber-toothed cats dominated the kill. But Homo habilis found opportunity where others saw scraps. Armed with sharp flakes of stone, they scavenged from carcasses left behind, prying open bones to reach the fatty marrow, a superfood packed with energy for their growing brains. In that moment, they weren't just scavengers. They were opportunists, innovators, survivors. Their bodies were smaller than ours, averaging just over 4 feet tall, but their brains were already expanding, nearly 50% larger than the apes they descended from. That brain power didn't just help them make tools. It helped them read the land, remember danger, and plan their next move. For the first time in human history, survival wasn't just about reacting. It was about anticipating. And that tiny leap, from instinct to foresight, was the crack in the door to everything that followed. But Homo habilis wasn't living in isolation. The African landscape of 2 million years ago was crowded with rivals, powerful predators, and even other hominin species. To survive, they had to adapt not only to the environment, but also to the competition. Picture a group of habilis cautiously approaching a watering hole. They know predators are watching. They also know other scavengers may already be near, yet they come anyway, because risk was the price of survival. And here's where things get fascinating. Survival didn't depend on strength alone. It depended on cooperation. Small groups of Homo habilis likely shared food, watched over one another, and taught each other how to use tools. These were the earliest whispers of community, the foundation of something we'd one day call society. Archaeologists have even found evidence suggesting they may have chosen safer living areas and returned to them repeatedly, creating the first hints of home bases. This wasn't random wandering anymore, it was intentional. It was planning. So when we talk about the dawn of Homo habilis, we're not just talking about a creature trying to survive. We're talking about the first sparks of humanity, tool makers, risk-takers, problem-solvers, laying the fragile groundwork for everything we are today. If Chapter 1 was about setting the scene, now we get to the heart of what made Homo habilis so groundbreaking, their tools. Imagine picking up a rock. Most animals might throw it or ignore it, but Homo habilis saw potential. With a strike of one, stone against another, they created sharp-edged flakes. Suddenly, a plain rock became a knife, a scraper, a survival tool. These weren't polished masterpieces, just crude cuts of stone. But don't underestimate them. These tools gave Homo habilis an advantage that no predator could match, the ability to change the environment, not just endure it. Think about it. Lions had claws, wolves had teeth, but Homo habilis had imagination. A single stone flake could strip meat from bone, cut through tough hides, or help dig for roots. That innovation multiplied their options for food, giving their brains more fuel to grow. And speaking of brains, this is where the story gets even more fascinating. Homo habilis had a brain about 600 cubic centimeters, nearly double the size of a chimpanzee's. That growth didn't happen by accident. It was fueled by their new diet, their constant problem-solving, and their need to adapt in a dangerous, changing world. Every strike of stone against stone was more than survival. It was evolution in action. But tools were only part of the story. What really made Homo habilis stand out was how they used those tools, and how their growing brains helped them think differently about the world. Unlike earlier species, who mostly reacted to danger or opportunity, Homo habilis began to anticipate. They didn't just grab scraps when they stumbled upon them. They learned to carry tools with them, ready for the next chance. That single idea, preparation, was revolutionary. It meant they could plan ahead, a skill that's unmistakably human. And their brains weren't just bigger, they were wired differently. Larger frontal lobes meant better problem-solving and memory. Imagine a group of habilis remembering where predators prowled or which paths led to water. This wasn't random luck anymore. It was strategy. Of course, survival was still brutally difficult. Every day was a gamble against hunger and predators. But here's the fascinating twist. Their ability to think ahead, to use tools, to adapt, meant Homo habilis wasn't just surviving. They were changing the rules of survival itself. For the first time, an ancestor of ours wasn't just shaped by the environment. They were beginning to shape the environment in return. And that shift, the moment when humans stopped being passive victims of nature, is the real secret behind their success. Here's where it all comes together. The mix of tools, brainpower, and survival instincts that made Homo habilis a true turning point in our story. They weren't the fastest runners. They weren't the strongest hunters. They weren't even the top predators of their time. But what they were was adaptable. And in evolution, adaptability always wins. When drought struck, they dug for roots. When predators stole their kills, they scavenged what was left. When danger loomed, they worked together in groups. This ability to bend without breaking is exactly what allowed them to survive where others couldn't. Archaeological sites even suggest they shared food within their groups, which may not sound revolutionary, but it was. Sharing meant cooperation. Cooperation meant stronger bonds, and stronger bonds laid the groundwork for something far bigger, the social fabric that defines us as humans today. So, if we zoom out, Homo habilis wasn't just another hominin species scratching out an existence. They were pioneers, creatures who taught us that intelligence could beat brute strength, that a sharp stone could stand against fangs and claws, that foresight and teamwork were more powerful than muscle alone. In short, they lit the first sparks of humanity, sparks that millions of years later would blaze into everything we call civilization. When we imagine Homo habilis, it's tempting to think of them as primitive scavengers, more animal than human. But here's the question that keeps scientists debating. How human were they really? Let's start with communication. They didn't have complex language like us, but their growing brains and group survival suggest they weren't silent either. Picture a group at night, huddled together after scavenging a kill. Simple sounds, grunts, calls, gestures, may have carried meaning. Danger ahead, food here, stay close. These weren't random noises. They were the building blocks of something extraordinary, the first whispers of human communication. And then there's the evidence of care. Fossils show signs that some individuals lived with injuries that would have made survival alone impossible. How did they make it? Likely because others helped, sharing food, protecting them, keeping them alive. That single act of caring changes the story. It suggests Homo habilis wasn't just a creature of instinct. They were capable of empathy, of seeing another's struggle and responding. Think about how massive that is. For the first time, survival wasn't just me versus the world. It was us versus the world. And that simple shift toward cooperation, toward care, wasn't just survival. It was the earliest seed of humanity as we know it. Let's pause for a second and ask something bold. Could Homo habilis imagine? On the surface, it seems impossible. They didn't paint caves, they didn't carve symbols, they didn't leave behind evidence of art. But imagination isn't only about painting or storytelling. It begins with something far simpler, the ability to see beyond the present moment. And Homo habilis did exactly that. When they chipped a stone to make a tool, they weren't just reacting. They were shaping a future action. That flake of rock wasn't food yet, but it could be. That's imagination in its most primal form, the ability to look at the world not just as it is, but as it could be. And what about dreaming? Picture them lying under a sky blazing with stars, their bellies full after scavenging a hard-won meal. Did their growing minds wander? Did they remember past dangers or anticipate tomorrow's hunt? We may never know, but what's clear is that their brains had crossed a threshold. They weren't simply living moment to moment anymore. They were beginning to plan, to anticipate, to create mental maps of survival. In that leap, from instinct to imagination, we see the flicker of humanity, a flicker that would one day ignite into art, language, and culture. So were they truly more human than we think? Let's weigh the evidence. They walked upright like us. They crafted tools, crude but effective. They lived in groups, scavenged with strategy, and cared for one another when survival alone would have been impossible. Their brains were growing, their instincts were sharpening into something more. Piece by piece, Homo habilis was crossing a line. But here's the fascinating part. They weren't fully human as we define it today. They didn't build villages. They didn't speak in sentences. They didn't leave behind art or ritual. They existed in a fragile in-between, a bridge between what came before and what would come after. Yet in that in-between lies something profound, because when we look at Homo habilis, we're not just looking at bones in a museum. We're looking at the spark that would become us. Every decision they made, every stone struck, every scrap of marrow eaten, every act of care within their group was a step toward humanity. So maybe the better question isn't, were they human? Maybe it's this. Without Homo habilis, would we have ever become human at all? They may not have looked like us, but in the most important ways, they were already carrying the flame we still hold today. So what do we make of Homo habilis? They weren't kings of the savannah, they weren't the fiercest hunters, and they certainly weren't modern humans, but they didn't need to be. What they gave us was far more valuable. The first proof. That intelligence, adaptability, and cooperation could be stronger than claws or fangs. They were the bridge between instinct and imagination. The spark that grew into fire, language, art, and every skyscraper, smartphone, and song we know today. In their hands, a stone became more than a stone. It became the first step toward civilization. And maybe that's why they still matter. Because when we ask if they were more human than we think, the answer is yes, not because they were exactly like us, but because they carried the seed of everything we are. Now I want to ask you, when you picture Homo habilis, small, fragile, yet endlessly resourceful, do you see something alien? Or do you see use? If you found this journey fascinating, don't let it end here. Hit that subscribe button for more deep dives into our shared human past, drop a comment with your thoughts, and share this video with someone who loves history as much as you do, because the story of humanity isn't finished, it's still being written, one spark at a time.